and good afternoon. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining the program. My guest is Michael Schmidt. He's returning with us. He's a blogger, he's a writer, he's a thinker. His blog is Michael Schmidt, the intellect. What is it? Introduce it, Michael.
The name of my blog is Conservative Thinker, and you can find it at www.conservativethinker.net.
And now, Michael, you draw from history in order to understand present political situations and where we are as a culture, which is a very important thing. And with regard to China, which of course is right now the instigator of the Wuhan virus around the world, they didn't have to do that. They could have contained it, but instead their lackeys over at the WHO pretended that the virus was not contagious for 5 weeks while people spread around the world, giving people the contagion, and other acts of aggression against other countries. You give a little perspective and history of how it is that we began normalizing relations with communist China back in the Nixon administration. So let's start there.
Well, thank you. I think this is an important topic, and especially now with the election coming up, it should be front and center in everybody's minds, especially with what's happened over the last few months. And so as a historian, I like to go back and view events that have happened over the last 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, and actually take a real good hard look at them, see if they've been successful or if they've been abysmal failures. And when you ask most people about Richard Nixon, I think the vast majority of people would come to the conclusion the first thought they would have would be the Watergate scandal. And that's a legitimate, it was a watershed moment in American history. And I think that's a fair assessment to come across. But under the radar, and probably at this point, I would argue even more of a stain on Nixon's record is his trip to China in February of '72. He went over to China, in essence, him and Kissinger. The idea is a foreign policy approach to open up China, to open up the communist regime to free the nations of the world as a legitimate partner. And by doing that, hoping that they would, can you still see me? Okay.
Yeah.
Hoping that they would open up and become a much more democratic, open, freedom-loving society. Now, as we look back on it almost 50 years later, we can see that has been an abysmal failure. It hasn't happened. And we can look at what happened with the virus situation, but even before that, we can look at what they've been doing in the South China Sea. They have worked on taking back nearly 3,200 acres of land in the South China Sea, reclaiming it. And they claim that as their historical maritime rights. So they are claiming roughly 1,200 miles of South China Sea, all the way out from mainland China, and all within 100 miles of places like Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And so you can see that they have imperialistic aims. And those imperialistic aims have not been thwarted in the least by our opening them up to free trade. And as I stated in my piece, Nixon has tried to really hope that this would be a way to thwart their imperialistic aims. And even close to his death in 1994, Nixon almost came to the realization that, you know what, maybe that wasn't the greatest idea. And he thought that we may have created a Frankenstein's monster. And in essence, we have fed the crocodile for the last 50 years. And now the crocodile is extremely large. And not only Nixon, but all the previous administration, all the administrations after him have done the same thing. They've appeased China. And the only person that has made an attempt to try to rein China in and confront them has been President Trump. And
that is very true.
And I believe that is something that we need to continue to do. And that's why it sets up for this election for folks to understand, you'll have to, in your mind, figure out, okay, well, will Joe Biden be a better choice to help rein in China, or will President Trump? And I think clearly, if we look at policy and we look at Biden's history, I think China is licking their chops if Biden becomes president of the United States.
Right. And there may even be some evidence that China's been involved in trying to subvert the Trump administration. But
Yes.
you're quite right. Starting with Nixon's 1972 trip to China, successive administrations, both Democrat and Republican, have further appeased China and created this massive trade deficit, allowed China to manipulate their currency in a manner that has hurt American industry and American labor. Jimmy Carter basically completely cut ties with Taiwan, the Republic of China, which lost its seat in the UN and transferred it to the Communist Chinese. Bill Clinton, he made, I think his main orientation was money, frankly. He made
Yes.
all kinds of deals with Chinese groups like the Lippo Group and Johnny Chang and others for money, for building the Clinton Library, for
Mhm.
furthering his power. And that included allegedly some trade of American military secrets and cyber secrets. And this was a scandal that was just starting to break around the time the Monica Lewinsky thing became prominent, and the special prosecutors shifted their attention from what was called Chinagate to that, which in a sense was a huge diversion. And so we never really got to the bottom of it. And he also gave China most favored nation trading status, which furthered the deficit. And as you say, today China is hegemonic. It's aggressive to its neighbors. It has put apparently hundreds of thousands of its own citizens, the Uyghurs, into concentration camps. It is cracking down on Hong Kong after promising not to do so to a degree that we can only speculate on. Uh, Tibet is being deracinized and destroyed, and I think that they're sending armies to the border of India. You know, you have them buying up businesses and using their political and military and economic clout in Africa, in Asia. They've basically compromised regimes all throughout that part of the world, and even in the United States. And so, you know, we've known for a long time that they're involved with industrial espionage or and gathering of intelligence. They intimidate Chinese citizens of the United States with their Confucius clubs on campuses that basically do the same thing they do in China, which is keep an eye on people to make sure they're politically correct and take measures against them if they're not. And they've compromised, in my opinion, and I say this very carefully because these are people who help my program here. But they have compromised, according to a lot of experts, Google and Facebook, in that they've agreed that in order to do business in China, which is very lucrative, they would participate in the Chinese agenda of controlling their citizens through these what do they call it? These social scores.
Right.
Like in China, people get a score for whether or not they're good for the regime or they're against. And if you have a low social score, if you engage in free speech and say something that's seen as quote politically incorrect, you can get a low social score, and that means you cannot do certain things that ordinary people can do. You can't travel from point A to point B. You can't purchase certain things. You don't have the same rights. And there have been those who have set the alarm on this because Google has cooperated that this very well may happen in this country. And I honestly don't think that that's at all far fetched. You know, who in this country, for example, even last March, would have thought that the government would recommend and would even enforce a complete shutdown of business and of telling people they have to stay inside in the name of preventing a virus? I mean, it's and yet they have. So you know, it's very conceivable that in America we could end up with social scores, and that we could, in a sense, this is the infiltration of the Chinese influence, the communist Chinese influence on America.
Yeah, you make some excellent points, Charles. And I will play off of those a little bit. One would be the Uyghurs. If you've seen any of the drone footage that's been around on the internet, and it has been verified by various intelligence agencies, it is very reminiscent of Nazi Germany and the SS loading up Jews into railroad cars and taking them off to concentration camps. The Uyghurs are Turkish-speaking Muslims, and they are primarily in Xinjiang region of China and northwest China, and they are being persecuted. I don't know how else to put it, and it is something that if you're on Twitter, if you're on Facebook, there are several people who've been sharing more and more of this, and again, these are atrocities that you can't be silent about. Too many people, New York Times, Washington Post, and others were silent during the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. They would have much rather have the reporters be cozy with Hitler and the Nazis than to actually report on what was going on. And they knew all along what was going on. And so we also have that today with our current media. Our current media seems to have a love affair with China, and that poses a problem. And I think it's important that people delve into this stuff a little bit more. They dive in and learn more about China, that they learn more about the Uyghurs and what's happening over there. Also to learn more about China and their aggression. And again, reminds me a lot, if you look back into historical reference to Nazi Germany. If you look at Nazi Germany, they demilitarized the Rhineland, and Europe said, okay, fine, we'll let you do that. And then
they grabbed another slice of the salami.
Yep, and then they annexed the Sudetenland, and then they had the Anschluss with Austria, and Europe said, okay, that's fine, and they kept appeasing them, and then if you remember, Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany and had Hitler sign a piece of paper and came back to London and waved, peace in our time. And basically a year later, Hitler rolls into Poland, and that starts World War II. So I see this same trend. Now let's hope we don't end up with a World War III where it's United States and China. But if there's going to be problems, it's going to start in that South China Sea area, which has become a very, very contested area. I believe Secretary Pompeo came out last week, and they are increasing their naval runs through the South China Sea, and they're going to put a little bit more pressure on China, running up and down the South China Sea. And we'll be curious to see how China responds to this. If they start bringing some of their ships a little closer to American ships, whether we start having more confrontations with our aircrafts in the region. So again, I like the approach of trying to challenge China a little bit more, because in essence, the Obama administration for 8 years let China do what they wanted, and China got the impression, okay, well, America's not going to do anything. We can have the South China Sea. We can do what we want. And now, again, if you kick the can down the road long enough, you end up with far worse problems in the long run, and that's what history tells us.
No, I think you're purporting this accurately. The Trump administration is standing up to China, both with the trade agreement, which resulted in a huge boon for American farmers, which caused protection of intellectual property in the United States and cyber property, and which generally implemented a tariff that was a great improvement, not a huge tariff to the point where it's going to result in an imbalance, but an improvement in terms of making sure that Chinese imports are not going to undercut the American market, and putting a few dollars into the U.S. Treasury from the tariffs itself, because the tariff is ultimately a tax on foreign imports. And also, sending the naval fleet into the South China Sea area. China is waving a saber at Taiwan and at the South China Sea, and Trump is standing up to it. So I think you're quite right, Michael, when you say that if Biden's elected, who, by the way, his son Hunter Biden, on the taxpayer dime, I think went on 27 trips to China. where
Yes.
he and his family and their relatives received millions of dollars, who knows how much money, in contracts with Chinese companies while Biden was vice president and while Biden was the head of the Chinese portfolio in the Obama administration. I mean, can we really trust Biden, putting
No.
aside his mental facilities,
Right.
to stand up to China at this time? I'd say not.
No. And he's made statements over the last several weeks where he is in full support of China. I don't see any circumstance where he would be harsh in any way towards China in a foreign policy approach. And I think after what has happened with the virus, I believe that we need to continue with a foreign policy approach of coming at China and not letting them continue with this appeasement. And I think Churchill put it best. An appeaser is one who feeds the crocodile, hoping it'll eat him last. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we have fed the crocodile for the last 50 years, and now I think we have to understand that at some point you're going to have to change course. And unfortunately, when you deal with regimes like China, when you deal with regimes like the old Soviet Union, you just can't bake a cake and sing kumbaya. They don't understand that approach, and they will take advantage of that approach. And so I think, again, it's important to look back at history and to understand. It's not just Republican and Democrat administrations. It's a matter of looking at both of them. And a lot of times it's very important to look at who they surround themselves with as far as their foreign policy experts. And the vast majority of these times that they surround themselves, they tend to be from the field of academia. And that has its merits from a certain standpoint. However, unfortunately, a lot of times these academics tend to have an idealistic approach, and it's all
Well,
by
they tend to not really be operating in the real world. Everything is
correct.
theoretical. They're administrative. A good example of that, I mean, not to change the subject a little bit, would be Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Hmm.
He hasn't really served a patient since the 1970s.
Right.
He's a bureaucrat. And so you have people in positions of great influence who really don't know the actual day to day realities of the fields that they represent. And I think that tends to be true with academics, only in that they're not going outside and kicking the tires. They're not like seeing the actual effects of their ideas. Historically, the ultimate example of this would have been Karl Marx. He
Hmm.
never went to a factory. He never went. In fact, he vigorously refused to go, even though his partner Engels invited him. He said no, he doesn't want to see it. The Nazis, Hitler never actually visited a concentration camp. Neither did Stalin.
Right.
They don't want to see the things that they're promoting and that they're condoning and that they're pushing forward, because they'd rather live in this kind of ethereal world, this sort of bubble that in a way creates a perhaps an emotional, if not a literal, barrier between themselves and what they're actually doing. They don't want to take responsibility for it. They'd rather continue in the world of ideas rather than in the world of reality.
Well, and John F. Kennedy said
Excuse me.
famously that domestic policy can harm us, but foreign policy can kill us. And foreign policy is an extremely important aspect of any president, and it should be the highlight of any presidential run. Obviously, we have domestic issues going on in this country right now that need to be addressed. But from a foreign policy standpoint, I believe China should be, first and foremost front policy to be discussed, and whether President Trump and Biden have debates coming up, whether they're live on stage or whether they do it remotely or however they run it. This should be a topic that I hope President Trump really comes after Joe Biden on and tries to separate himself and try to really make the American people understand the importance of the issue that you and I are talking about today, because I believe most people don't really think about foreign policy. Obviously, most people go to work, they come home, they think about their family, they think about domestic issues, the pocketbook. But foreign policy affects that. And how we approach China and what policies we enact against them are going to, in essence, affect your pocketbook and affect. I mean, vast majority of our drugs are made in China, as we found out through this whole process. Hopefully, if anything, the virus has maybe woke some people up to the fact that we need to start bringing some stuff back home to America, bring our factories back, bring our medicines back, and start being more reliant on us as a country making our own products as compared to trusting China, who is a communist nation.
And yeah, we can, as the old saying goes, you can trust a communist to be a communist.
Absolutely.
This is not their idea of an agreement or a treaty is simply as a way station before they can gain more strength in the future and then get rid of the agreement. It's
Yes.
not it's not the way we view things conventionally in the West, which is an agreement involves the integrity and the honor and the honesty of both parties, and that there is a trade of values that both sides gain and both sides lose a little bit, but they enter into it openly and in the sunlight. That's not how. You have to understand that the communist world, the communist view, isn't consonant with that. It's based on the idea that everything is about power because they have some kind of an innate virtue that they want to create this utopian entity, and so that anything goes, everything is justified in that quest, including the murders of millions of people if they're standing in the way of what they view as progress. So, it's like Ronald Reagan said when he signed the nuclear accord with Russia,
Trust but verify.
trust but verify. I know I used a Russian slogan to make that point. And that's what you need to do when you're dealing with a country like China. You enter agreements, but you put in all these means to make sure that everything is observed, and you stay strong. You don't trust. You enter with a good deal of opened eyes to the situation. And I think that if there's one thing that Trump is into, it's that. I mean, he's been talking about China for 30 years,
Yes.
and this has been a major aspect of his views, and he's done it. He's walked the walk.
He has.
So Trump has to be given credit for that, and we need to look at that going forward, especially in the next many years.
Well, and I find this quote important too, because Henry Kissinger, who's very much in favor of a one China policy and has been most of his life, he quoted. He says, "We Americans have a tendency to apply our standards to others in negotiations. We like to pay in advance to show our goodwill, but in foreign policy, you never get paid for services already rendered." And I think that's important because that's where we have failed, quite honestly, in the approach with China. Nixon and Kissinger didn't take their own advice in that policy when they went to China. And so I also think that Taiwan is going to be a real big focal point because China this is an unsettled question.
Oh yeah.
It has been for generations. And so at some point, and I'm guessing sooner rather than later, Xi Jinping is going to push the issue on Taiwan. And Xi Jinping, since he became the head of the CCP, he really wants to be the next Mao Zedong. He has
openly.
Yes.
Do you know that he actually moved into the house of Mao Zedong?
I did not know that.
Yeah, I mean, he's like setting himself up as the new God King, the
Yes.
emperor for life.
Yes.
To be worshipped and venerated. And the Chinese people, a lot of them seem to be falling into line, which brings up another issue. I don't know if you know anything about that, but I see two movements in China that are hopeful. The first is the major advancement of Christianity in China, both
Yes.
Catholicism and Protestantism. You have people converting to Christianity at a very rapid rate. And I had on this program a while back a Chinese dissident who leads a Christian group who told me that China is a lot like the Roman Empire was before Constantine. In other words, you had Christianity growing like wildfire and people embracing the faith to the point where Constantine woke up one day and he looked at his realm and he said, "It's Christian." And he gave up the ghost, and he became Christian himself at the end of his life.
Hmm.
That could happen in China. And that the second movement that I am encouraged by is Falun Gong. I don't know if you know anything about them, but
I do not.
they strike me as being similar to the American civil rights movement of Martin Luther King in the 1960s. They're into nonviolent resistance. They're into nonviolent protest and into just an outreach to the population. And they are based upon some religious principles. I think it derives from Confucianism. It's some ancient ideas that basically are just a moral and ethical list of principles. And that they're trying to make major inroads in China. And both Christians and Falun Gong members are being persecuted in China. In fact, just yesterday, it came out that China is telling its citizens to put away any artifacts that would relate to Christianity. They're not to display crosses, they're not to display images of Jesus. All of that is now being banned in China.
Mm-hmm.
So it tells me that the regime is really threatened by these two movements and that both of them are making major advances. Do you have any information about that, Michael?
I do not. I do know that for years now, the Christian missionaries have been doing yeoman's work in China. And I know that they put their lives on the line every day in China, and for fear of being caught and for fear of being persecuted and thrown into concentration camps and quote unquote re-educated, or worse, being tortured for the rest of their life for claiming Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior and for preaching it. So that has not been that has been a long standing thing, and that goes back years and years now that you've heard about it, especially from a lot of the Christian churches, where I've read articles about how they have to have these services in very, very small, close groups, and they have to hope that nobody is a spy for the Chinese government, that they are going to report them. And so, but I do agree with you. I think that does provide hope. And as I wrote in my piece, though, I remember Tiananmen Square very fondly, in the sense that it was a few days before my graduation of high school in 1989, June of '89. And so the way that was brutally put down by the communist regime. And since then, you have not had any kind of uprising that we are aware of in China. And now, obviously, we've got the Hong Kong protests going on, and now Hong Kong was one of the freest countries in the world, under British rule until 1997, when Britain gave that over to China, and China has now decided to clamp down and over the last few years and take away those freedoms and that liberty. And like I wrote in my piece towards the conclusion, you know, ultimately it's going to be up to the Chinese people whether or not they want to throw off this communist regime, and whether they have the fortitude and the heart and the energy to actually change their situation. Unfortunately, we in the West, through foreign policy, try to change regimes, and that hasn't been very successful over the years. You can try like Reagan and Thatcher and Pope John Paul II did, where all three of them kind of came together, and through their ideas and their hope and their ideology, they worked on bringing down the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union. And so obviously, I believe ideas are important, and it's important to share those and preach those, and to have statesmen who will do that. So I'm not disregarding that, but for us to think that we can bring freedom and liberty to a country through opening them up through free trade, or by trying to bring down their brutal dictator and put somebody else in place. Typically, you have a vacuum that forms, and typically somebody else who's even worse fills that vacuum. I think we have to be very careful in how we go about doing this. I would say to President Trump, I mean, I would definitely double down on Taiwan, and I would show your support for Taiwan. And I know the news media will blow him up on that, but I believe that sends an important signal to China, and it will upset the Chinese communists. But I think he needs to stand with Taiwan now more than ever, and I think he needs to show support for Hong Kong as well. And
He has, I mean, recently,
I
and I
know he
think that
has, and I think he needs to
regarding Taiwan, I think it needs to be done in alliance with leaders in Japan, South Korea, maybe Singapore, Philippines, some of the regional powers, the Asian tigers, as they call them.
Yes.
They have to form a united front in the same way that Reagan did with Pope John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher, and Eastern European leaders like Lech Walesa and
Yes.
Václav Havel to
Mm-hmm.
bring down the Soviet Union, and they did it without firing a shot.
Yes.
So it's an enormously inspiring example that you bring up, Michael. Michael, can you let my listeners and viewers know how they can read your blog site and any other information about you that you'd like to impart?
Well, if people want to check me out and check out my writing, you can find my blog. It's called Conservative Thinker, and it's www.conservativethinker.net, conservativethinker.net. You can find me on Twitter. I am very active on Twitter, sharing stories and highlighting things that I find extremely important to share. I am at Bucky Boy Mike on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. I do share stuff on LinkedIn as well. Michael Schmidt, look me up there. I also am on Facebook. You can find me on Facebook, Michael Schmidt as well. I hopefully, by doing these podcasts with you and writing, hopefully we can open up more people's eyes to the truth and facts and what's going on in the world, and get more people to dive into these subjects. So.
Absolutely. We can only do the best we can do. And, I really appreciate your work, Michael. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Charles. I appreciate